I'm writing solo tonight, so I'm not the best when it comes to live streaming software. If you all can hear me, please let me know. We'll do like an hour and a half to 2 hours like we usually do. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, it should be. I drank a giant cup of coffee, so if you'll allow me a break or two, we'll make it.
Nice. Let's I just want to check here. No introduction. No, I am serious tonight. I am is taking a break. He has some other activities to attend to. Oh yeah, we're live. All right, great. Tom Kwasinski is back tonight. He's a dear friend of mine and a friend of MGTOW Chat. Say hello to everyone, Tom.
Hey, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it. Always a pleasure to come back.
Tom is now no longer found on YouTube as of this week. Congratulations, Tom.
Yeah, I managed to lock up those strikes pretty quickly. It was interesting. They hit me with a second one for a video I did 18 months ago. And then they hit me for a third one, which I still don't know what it was for. But when I asked them to appeal it, they couldn't find what email address was associated with the account, which I thought was pretty quick considering it only took about 2 hours. So I am now officially persona non grata, although we do still have the Telegram up, t.me/Atlantic Homeland. And believe it or not, I still do sermons on Sunday, although we'll see how well the live function works now that they cost me, I don't know, about 2,000 of my subscribers.
Well, you had an Odyssey account briefly for like 2 years ago. I liked what you did over on Odyssey, though you didn't. I guess because just there's a lack of following or whatever, and YouTube you kind of have a broader audience.
That's part of it. Another big part of it is I hate video editing. If it's up to me, to tell you the truth, I'm almost like an AM radio type throwback. I would rather just sit here, kind of like we're doing tonight, talk for 2 hours, go through the different ideas that are out there, because I think people get caught up too much in the images. Like if you saw me right now, dressed in my usual plaid upon plaid ensemble, it would probably be distracting. But since you and I are just talking, it ends up working a lot better. But yeah, I mean, I was able to put some things that were more advanced together. The problem is at this point, a big reason why I did the work I did was I was trying to warn people about things that were coming down the line. And I'm kind of like at a point where I figure if people who have listened to me haven't gotten the gist yet, they're not going to. And you reach a point where, as a content producer, you really feel like you're saying the same thing over and over again at some point, which, there's certain things that's fine with. But at some point, how many times do we have to say inflation's a problem? How many times do we have to say, the culture's a mess? And I guess the interesting thing is really, and maybe this would be a good topic for tonight amongst everything else, is where do we go from here? What can we do? Because it feels like we're in a trap where we have something mediocre. Any effort to change it's going to make it worse. There's too much institutional resistance to make it happen. And yet we still have to live day to day, just kind of like waiting for the ennui to catch up with us. And it's a hard time,
Well, I try my best not to repeat myself. Obviously, doing this for 5 years, some of the hardcore listeners that have been following me for a half a decade will probably hear me from time and again repeat myself. And I realized that in order to get new information and try to keep it fresh, you really have to read a lot. And then that kind of like you have to read and prep for the show, and then you have what's going on in your regular life, so it's really hard to kind of keep things fresh and keep the listeners entertained. Like people that I've listened to 3, 4, 5 years ago, I don't necessarily listen to now. Sometimes I'll circle back and see if they've brought any new fresh content. I was chatting with I think one of the guys over at Myth of the 20th Century, because they don't necessarily put out shows like they used to. They used to do, I think, a show like every week. Now it's like every other month, and I'm like, what's up? What happened to you guys? And they were like, well, we've said our piece. What more can we bring to the table? I know John Q. Publius had somewhat of the same sentiment. He goes, my work here is done. This is it. I'm presenting you the work. I'm presenting you the facts. What more can I bring that hasn't been that has been presented by other content creators. And I've kind of sensed that from you maybe like a month and a half, 2 months ago. But yeah, I still do this. I have a lot more things to pontificate on, to say the least. And
Well, that's because you follow pop culture a little bit too. That helps.
it does, and I try to stay up with current events. Hang on one second. Having
Sure.
myself a nice cream soda, nice non-alcoholic beverage tonight. Anyway,
Man, well, if we go 2 hours, I'll probably have a White Russian before the end of the thing. You know.
I've been enjoying brandy as of late. I'm trying to get myself flavored brandies, but I don't know where to buy flavored brandies. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Tom, like I said, I've been following you now for 3 years. I remember when you were on Podbean, you got banned from there. I think you were on, was it Apple Podcast? Got banned from there. There was a couple others
Spotify,
that you got.
that one too.
Yeah, you're banned
They
off
were
of there.
fast.
Surprisingly, you're not banned off of Amazon. And for all you listeners out there, check out some of Tom's work. If you haven't already, type in Tom Kwasinski. Some of his books include Loyal, Revolutionary, and Honest Handbook for Extraordinary Times. End the Con, a plan to take back our America. We have incoming red lines and hot takes from the coming Civil War. Come out of Babylon, how America fell so far from grace. Your most popular book, The Coming Civil War. Your more recent book, Surviving the Fall of America. And
Doing okay, actually. That one's selling all right.
and I think you just put out something else. I think a week and a half, 2 weeks ago.
We did. Behold the Beast System. The social credit scores incoming, CDBC, central bank, or CBDC rather, I should say, central bank digital currencies. Chinese style social credit score system. All of this stuff is coming in, but to connect my writing with the show. The funny thing about Coronavirus Central, where a lot of people got to know me from, was it was a marketing thing for a book I wrote, Surviving Coronavirus, which actually I realized sold a bunch of copies before the WHO banned every book basically on coronavirus, which was kind of funny how that worked out but I ended up starting the show. We got to number 5 on the Apple iTunes rankings, which, considering at the time I was on the SPLC watch list, I think that's a pretty impressive thing to pull off. And really, it was because it was good information and good content. But this is the problem as a broadcaster these days. I was covering the medical story as it unfolded, rightly or wrongly, but following the evidence. And these days, you can't do that. I mean, I'll tell you what I got my strikes for on YouTube. I got it for talking about medical intervention. You know which one I'm talking about. I got it for talking about, the quality of election integrity. Even though I talked about 2 years ago and literally just simple trends analysis, but Lord knows no one knows how to do statistical regression these days. And third, because I proselytize, I talk about the Lord Jesus. So for me, it's not even like there aren't things to talk about. What it really is there isn't the right platform for us to talk about it. And I think that's a big part of the problem. Yes, there are alternative platforms with their individual pros and cons, but we're being pushed into a smaller and smaller box, which is sort of ironic because at this point, I don't think there's ever been greater demand for sane solutions. And yet we're not allowed to present them to the public. And most of the public is so tired, even though they don't want it, I think they're meeting it with one giant collective shrug. And the interesting thing of the system at this point, and this is kind of the thing I'm thinking about, that why they're switching to the CDBC system, of having a single currency, is that people now, you can't get people to resist the system, but you can't really get people to do things either. The Great Resignation or whatever they call it these days. Who gives a crap? And that's kind of the problem. And I say this, I hate to say it, but I kind of understand why people are at that point, because we've reached a point where the system basically can defend its own corruption, but it really can't do anything beyond that, even if it wanted to. And so we're just sort of stuck here watching this thinking, this is weird.
Well, it's happening in real time. I'm surprised that nothing significant has transpired. I know you did a chat with Scott Howard in December, and he's someone that I don't, what he has to say, I take serious. Whenever he speaks, whatever he writes about, I listen, right? And he said, give it 6 months, you'll start seeing things, start seeing the wheels fall off the gravy train with biscuit wheels. I mean, at some point, it's got to come to a headwind. But we're still here. Gas is under $4. People are out having a good time. Labor Day weekend, I saw the restaurants packed. People are walking around their downtowns. The dog parks are filled. So it seems as if we're still there's still gas in the tank, so to speak.
Well, think of it this way. If you were rich and used to being rich, okay, how would you avoid being poor? It's one of those questions. And this is sort of my answer to your question about why I think the bottom hasn't fallen out yet. Because we're robbing our good friends in Europe. And let me lay it out for you.
Go for it.
And you follow currency a little bit, so you know what I'm talking about. Not only has the euro reached parity with the dollar, but so has the pound sterling. And we see the industrial base of Europe is collapsing underneath the combination of insane green energy policies that are put by an elite that hate their own people, as evidenced by Kalergi plan actions, all that stuff you know about, as well as the green energy policies you see throughout there, where we're now reaching a point where in most European countries, the cost of food and fuel alone is greater than the average household income. We're seeing energy prices increase tenfold, and those profits are being funneled back into America, and America's sending it back out, or I should say it's going to Ukraine to basically launder it back to the deep state sort of military-industrial complex contractor types. So we've reached the point where America has been allowed to have an Indian summer, although, to be fair, since you mentioned the gas prices have gone down, you're right, but so has our reserve, and that's about to hit the bottom. Now, we're looking at potentially a major railroad strike. The Biden administration went out there the other day and said, hey, we worked out a plan. And the union leadership worked out a plan with the Democratic leadership on the Hill. But the problem with it is the workers hate the plan because it doesn't solve their problems. So we're looking at the potential of a rail strike. We're looking at problems with sanctions potentially coming out of China, which will otherwise destroy the economy. You're looking at the Federal Reserve on the 21st putting another 75 to 100 basis points, or 0.75 to 1% on the interest rate. And you're seeing the home industry completely begin to crater because now there's going to be no new construction. So you can say we are having a last Indian summer. But I tell you what, they might do all they can do to carry it through November, but I don't even think it'll hold together that long. And if we have a cold winter or any other problem, I look at the fundamental structure of this economy. We don't produce anything. The finance value of our dollar has never been less. The Shanghai Cooperative Organization is getting larger all the time. And we're seeing, what do they call it, heartland come together. We're seeing Russia, China, great allies like India and Turkey come in to try to change the way currency is working around the world. And if you can do that to the dollar's buying time by basically sucking in the yen, the pound, the euro, those zones. But beyond that, the actual productive areas of the world, the manufacturing areas, are not on board with this. And so we have bought time for the United States. And you could argue that it's bought time for the West, where we've basically, cannibalized our own vassals. But I think in the long term, there's going to be a big problem there.
Well, Turkey decided to join the SINO orbit, being the first NATO member to join that Shanghai Corporation, that cooperation agreement. I thought that was interesting. And why NATO's in, why Turkey's in NATO is a whole other subject that it's questionable to say the least. Obviously, the hatred towards Russia, but also the other news that came out today that 43% or 43 companies, large firms in England, are filing for bankruptcy. I don't know if you saw that in the news today.
I did see that. Yeah, it's the British economy is utterly dependent at this point on its finance sectors. But even in Britain, they got another problem. Felixstowe, which is the biggest port in the UK, it's like their Long Beach. Okay. Is looking at having an 8-day strike, I think, next month, if I remember. Maybe it's later this month. So they've got a lot of problems. Plus, you got Charles coming in here, and we don't know what he is as a quantity. People think he's just some idiot fool, but these royal families have been around for a while. Very big World Economic Forum, Great Reset person. You have Liz Truss coming in there. And, you're seeing hints of the future lockdown sort of economy they want. And in a lot of ways, I think that's where Britain's going to go, because they'll say, well, we have to have universal basic income since no one can work, and we have to live with less. So everyone will be suffering. Everyone will have malnutrition. If you're of a mindset that, maybe there were people dying from some other cause, because remember, excess deaths are up 100%. What better way to hide that than under a complete squalid human misery? And people say, oh, it's ridiculous. Why would people do this? For the same reason that a lot of people who have power do things. You're bored, you want greater control, or if you already have everything, you try to extend and prolong it. And I mean, that's the interesting part of it when you start getting into sort of the more speculative transhumanist aspects. A lot of people think those things are 5, 10, 20 years away. I don't. I read DARPA documents. I think these technologies are here. It's an infrastructure rollout and testing problem. But the idea that we live as sovereign individuals in liberty, where our choices are our own, is something we need to start fundamentally questioning. I mean, you could say it just from the simple question of inputs and outputs. You're propagandized in school, you're propagandized through the media, but we're not even talking about environmental factors that people get sort of weirded out by. But think of it. How much screen time do we all spend on our smartphones or on our laptops? What sort of influences are we going through and following? I talked about this in Come Out of Babylon, but expanded on it a little bit more in Behold the Beast system, that we've reached the point where we are so dependent on these systems that what will happen is we will be drawn in. And even if we want a way out, I mean, if you have the fiat currency shift to a completely digital currency, how are you going to have people trade with one another? Are we just going to make script from scratch when none of us can trust one another? And it's sort of these problems I keep thinking about that make me feel more and more like being a hermit, because I'm not saying we can't survive in this system. What I'm saying is it will be very hard to survive outside of the system. And for those of us who are a little bit difficult, like some of your audience is, and I certainly am, it's a problem. And it really shapes how we look at everything in the future.
Correcting myself. Companies declared insolvent in England and Wales jumped by 43% in August, according to government data. So we could assume that it's much higher than that. I got a question. The only plain devil advocate regarding the digital currency. What do you think that the government and the powers that being would be against it because they prefer cash to handle their, like, guess you want to call them, like black ops, like like trying to fund a certain insurrection or something to that effect, where they don't necessarily want it to be tracked. They would prefer cash to handle some type of betting before a rogue state, or some type of insurgency in another country. Like if they're doing drug smuggling, the last thing you want is it to be on papers. You know what I mean?
Well, then you have to ask this question: how much do you trust the federal law enforcement apparatus to research these things and report on them, and how much do you trust the media to make these things publicly available?
True, right.
So, I mean, the thing is, when you have complete control of the information space, you can do whatever you want. You can steal an election when you shut up everyone who says this. You can spread an epidemic if you shut up everyone who says, here's contradictory evidence. Well, that's fake. You have to trust the science. You have to trust the process. And this is really what it is. And the point I've kind of come to learn over the course of a lifetime in politics and being a dissident is all warfare is psychological. But at this point, warfare has become so personalized where you, me, all of us are put in little boxes where we're allowed certain interactions, but we're always quarantined. And so to answer your question as devil's advocate, if the government was worried about these sorts of things, the World Economic Forum wouldn't be out there boasting about it.
Right.
They don't have to worry because they have whole generations of people coming up thinking this is normal, this is natural. Like, you like pop culture. Why is The Little Mermaid look so different now? Answer, so that they can take a beloved classic for many children, print a new picture on it with the same name, and then from therever after, they'll just be saying, oh yeah, the new one's better. This is what it was really all about all along. And you change history by that. Orwell covered it. It's nothing new, but the speed and rapidity at which it happens, a lot of times when people don't understand, when things are put out there, like this happens in media all the time, I mean mass media, like entertainment. A terrible thing is put out there to set a precedent. Nothing more. It's a lost leader on a restructuring of society. And we live in such a capitalist world model that a lot of people don't understand that. But the people who are actually on top, the bankers who fund these things, like the now defunct, thankfully, Tavistock Institute, although I'm sure they moved to something else. This is the way it always happens. Those were the people who not only pioneered, if you go back before World War One, the British propaganda machine, but also the transgenderism thing, that craziness, and the gender transition. So,
The transgender industrial complex.
yeah, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So these are the sort of people that you're going to have to think about, and they have access to basically limitless money to shape the way people act. And what's happened is the real change, I mean, if you want to talk macro change, is from the post-industrial economy that required human workers to an AI-driven economy where humans, from the perspective of an elite power broker, wherever you think, you don't need a big conspiracy to have this even. You just need someone to be a CEO. They'll say, look, we have more productivity by having less people. And you have enough people at the top have that sort of idea, you end up with a society where you basically have a conspiracy of the elites. It doesn't have to be everyone meeting in a dark room, but just a recognition that ends up happening within a certain class. Hey, we can jettison this. And I think as people are pushed into their self-interest, you're going to see that become sort of more blatant. When, they always use this word stakeholder, right? You got to listen to what they say. They're talking about stakeholders because they're saying people who matter. And I hate to say it, but it isn't you and me, but they're speaking to their peers as a class that sees themselves apart. And beneath all that, nationalism, politics, all that stuff is theater or means to an end about a restructuring of society where a narrow elite is basically trying to take the ladder of mobility and kick it over, trusting technology to keep them safe forevermore.
Well, let me ask you. So, I was listening to Big Bear. It's, my listeners who Big Bear is. And I've been indulging in some of his work the last couple of weeks, and he was talking about how they keep changing goalposts. So, example, they had Rio de Janeiro, 1992. They set out benchmarks for various countries to push forth, the great, not the Great Reset, but they kind of they're intertwined with Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. Again, so they had 1992. Then they had another meeting in 2012. Then they had a meeting, I think 2015, 2016. Then they had obviously another meeting right before COVID. Now they're pushing it further out to 2030. It seems that I don't necessarily agree with this, that they keep changing the benchmark and pushing these ideas further and further down the line into this decade, then the next decade, and they can't seem to bring up forth what it is they're trying to initiate. Me personally, I've looked underneath the hood with all that, and they want to see each decade. They want to see how much they've progressed through the decades on trying to get to the you will own nothing and be happy. Again, World Bank, World Economic Forum, and what it is what they're trying to initiate. Again, this whole AI driven digital currency, subscription based economy, so on and so forth. So what do you have to say about that? Do you think that as the boomers die off, I mean, you look at Congress, what is it, like 25% of Congress is like above the age of 75 or something crazy like that, right? That a new guard will come in and say, okay, you know what, forget this idea is stupid. Let's go back to nations duking it out and having, certain blocks fight amongst each other instead of having this neoliberal death machine blob take over the whole planet.
Well, no, I think they're going to go forward with it, right? Because the thing about it is people get caught up on have they accomplished the benchmarks, but I would ask the question differently. Have things generally moved in a trajectory they would prefer,
yes,
or in a trajectory that favors human liberty? And they're kind of like, think of it like water seeping through. Maybe that's a good example. That you see it falling, and it falls, as long as it falls into the bucket, it's just going to work till it erodes away, till holes come forward. And COVID eroded a lot of our protections. This understanding that people in a public emergency will give away all of their liberty, all their sort of rights, that sort of thing is out there. But look what that enabled. Look at the health passport things, like the Green Pass. that you see throughout Europe. That in fact they're talking about in England. That they say the BBC is saying shopkeepers want to bring this back this winter so that they know what they're doing. No shopkeeper wants that. Shopkeepers got killed by these things, and yet you see this propaganda march on, and what they've taken the point of doing is just silencing the opposition. So, I mean, when you look at what's happening, I think these people increasingly see themselves as a class above and apart, and they're going to act in that class interest. And within that, I mean, you have to ask, is it an elite, or does it an oligarchic type person, a Fortune 500 type person who lives in Japan or China or the US or Russia, do they have more in common? Now, you're seeing some alternative models, right? The Russians, you could argue, are an alternative model. The Chinese are an alternative model. Or maybe there are two blocks in a Cold War sort of stable configuration. But within the sort of sphere of that, you're seeing that basically Western Europe basically just follows the U.S. lead.
Right.
And you're seeing the sort of, well, I don't know how you want to balance the Russian-Chinese bloc. That's a complicated conversation. But you're seeing these things happen in a way that suggests that you will not see so much a return to nations. If anything, if what they do fails, I don't think you'll see stronger nations. I think what you'll see is competing jurisdictions. We've talked about that, but it's a great topic for this week. Consider what's happening over in Martha's Vineyard right now. We have the governor of Florida dumping a bunch of illegals there in Martha's Vineyard, which is a real posh place where, people from Mass go to and live, and they're going nuts about it. And people on the right are like, oh, show their inconsistency. I've known a lot of leftist liberals. I went to one of their schools. They don't care about being consistent. They care about making progress. And this, to come back to the beginning of your question, is all that matters. As long as they never give back an inch and they're moving along their way, they're happy. And if there are people who are non-compliant, they don't have to persuade them. They can simply marginalize them, because this is how they think politics of power, and remove them from the equation. It doesn't have to be popular. Look at Chile's constitution. They get a bunch of leftists in there who get elected, put in a new constitution, and 70% of the country said they don't want it. But they're going to keep moving in that direction. And if they don't get you, they'll keep educating your kids until they hate you, and they'll get them. And so I guess the question is, if you're going to stop this, is there a youth movement out there ready to act and do something, or has even the ability? I mean, you're closer to the ground than I am in that area. You'd have to tell me.
I'll get to that question in a second, but here's what I'm thinking, and I've mentioned this before in the live stream as we were talking about repeating ourselves. You heard Henry Kissinger when COVID broke out that this could be the end of the world order as we know it, right?
Sure.
It's you look at the lifespan of the Soviet Union, 1919 to 1991, 1992, 89, depending on who you ask, right? That's
Sure.
a lifespan of a man. The boomers love this whole cheap money, cheap goods from China, Walmart, have it on demand, Amazon Prime. They love all that. They love to identify with their dead objects. They love to identify with the Roth IRA. They love their 401k. They love identifying with their property values, so on and so forth. Once that cohort dies off, don't you think the up-and-coming generation, and it's going to skip Gen X. I don't even think they're even going to shot at this. It's going to go right to millennials, who are going to look at this and say, to hell with this model, let's bring in something different. Now, obviously, there's going to be a framework that they're going to be working within that's already been set forth by the baby boomers as the ones that we're discussing right now. They're going to work within the neoliberal machine. But at the same time, don't you see it like saying, you know what, that's a stupid idea. The browning of Canada is not really going to work out. You're kind of obviously hurting poor people, so on and so forth. There could be something like a dark horse that comes out of the ashes and says, to hell with that. Obviously, that's a bit of a pipe dream, because as you were saying, these people are, as Z-Man likes to call them, the cloud people. And they're also going to be, this new cohort is going to be initiated into being part of the cloud people. They go to the same schools. They all live in the same town. They live in like Alexander, Virginia. They live in Martha's Vineyard. We get that. But like, I'm just looking at this like, maybe something's gonna have to give. There has to be some type of breaking point with, at least with the poor masses, the peons, with this, I guess, laptop class, these caviar left, platitudes and lip service that they care about migrants. Like, obviously, we're not talking about that. What DeSantis did, bringing hordes of Guatemalans to Martha's Vineyard, is in fact human trafficking. You see what I'm saying? Like,
Sure.
you can't get around the fact what you did was in fact human trafficking. Furthermore, people are saying, "Oh, that's so cool that they did that." Well, you just brought more and more people into the United States. We wanted a wall. By you bringing a bunch of impoverished people from Venezuela and dumping them into Martha's Vineyard, that's not really winning over the hearts and minds of the people on this side of the Great Divide as far as the right side of politics goes.
Well, it's interesting to watch different people respond to it differently. There's sort of the reflexive, angry crowd that loves it because of the one side of it. But then there's the other one that looks at it from the national perspective of saying, as you said, that you're bringing in a bunch of people who are going to be, eventually have to be accounted for. I'm sort of in a different space altogether. When we did Pinelanders, we were in a post-national space. And my basic thought with immigration is, if it's people who are like me, think like me, who are going to act like me, I'm in favor of it. And if it's against it, I'm against that. But this is one of the things I'm talking about, that you're seeing these jurisdictions now fight each other. One of the interesting things happening like this with there's going to be a bill probably that's going to come up next year in Texas, assuming Dan Patrick, I believe he's the one running for it, for governor, to replace Abbott down there. They want to create a Texas state guard that will defend its own border, that will basically displace the National Guard, and they're going to take it to the Supreme Court. But what happens once states start having their own militaries? I mean, that they're going to stand up at that point. You're going to see a different level of violence and contact, and you'll see this internecine conflict where we're going to have to navigate through competing authorities that claim the same authority. That's going to make this an even bigger mess than it already is, and it's going to, I think, make more people lose faith in politics. Which, to come back to your point about the millennials, I think that where the boomers were obsessed with materialism, the millennials will prove obsessed with the approval of the system, which we already know they got from their negligent parents, okay? And also with the aesthetic. As long as a minimal technological base is made out there where people can choose to jack in somewhere instead of get thrown out in the cold, I think most millennials will choose to retreat into fantasy, as they already have, and as the sort of metaverse concept is promising will be out there. Now, I want to say one thing real fast here in defense of the boomers. A thought I had that occurred to me a couple of weeks ago is, as bad as they were, one thing we have to remember is they were the first generation to basically be subject to mass visual psychological programming, at the same time that they had probably the most aggressive drug experimentation regime. So if we wonder why we have a completely brainwashed population, I think it might be worth, and I know some people have done it, but it doesn't get talked about too much now, looking just how much damage was done by LSD and whatnot in the 60s, and what sort of suggestions may have been put out there, where we saw this cycle where basically that generation hollowed out the center of this country for the desire of the approval of the system, right? For this sort of idea that we were all going to be taken care of. Like, look, I spent 15 years living in Pittsburgh. There were guys there who were there all the way back to the 60s and 70s, and they told me why those steel mills got shut down, because they had to bring in people to work there who weren't going to work and who knew they wouldn't get fired because of how they looked. Not that different than the problems we're dealing with today, except we don't talk about them the same way. But ultimately, that's what started, businesses moving south, and then they just justified it. Well, we're not about making things anymore. We're about making money. And if you look at it, the history of America, we've now gotten to the point where our biggest exports are finance and entertainment. So all we have is this cultural psychological warfare that is committed effectively against our own people. But what we're going to see is if the Americanization of the world is enough to bring everyone into that umbrella.
Right.
And the resistance that exists to that are the people who are going to defend their own cultures. Ones that are highly religious, like the Muslim culture, I think will hold out. China might hold out. We'll see how well Russia holds out. It's an interesting test case. The Europeans fell over. And I think the same with South America in a lot of ways, because you watch it, even if because you can go on YouTube or wherever you're watching these people, they're basically behaving like Americans. Like my wife watches a lot of Canadian channels for whatever reason. And they're basically just Americans with an accent at this point. But it wasn't always that way. And that homogenization is really a big part of the story, where we think we're way different about things that don't matter, or we allow certain areas that aren't really anything other than self-mutilation. But ultimately, on the big issues that actually would be structurally required to have revolutionary change to prevent the control mechanism from going forward, we all kind of agree on everything. We just don't agree on who can run it. And so we just accept it. And as long as we have the sort of stage theater that is politics, we seem content to let pretty much anything go. And I think the bet they may make is that they can do the same with money, and that there's a lot more poor people than rich people. Throw a few rich people down, make the poor people feel like they're doing better, and you can have the hidden hand run the show. Which, and I don't necessarily mean it's a nefarious conspiracy so much. I mean, there's plenty of occultists right around that circle, but it's more like that they recognize that power is best exercised when you can't see it. It's like Chris Rock once said. He said he loves being rich, but he hates being famous. It sucks to be famous, but it's good to be rich if you're not famous. And if you have a leadership class that's willing to do that and kind of put themselves out of sight and out of mind, you can get away with a heck of a lot. And I don't think people want what's coming forward, but they have no experience and no infrastructure to stand against it. And that is the challenge. I mean, the cryptocurrency people tried a little bit. Some of the, dissident right figures have certainly talked about it, you and I amongst them.
Mm-hmm.
But, we are a self-selecting group that basically, are just making ourselves sort of targets for what's coming. And I don't want to be so black-pilled. I'm sort of not. I'm past it. I'm at a spiritual point.
It's a red pill that's like almost black, but it's purple.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You stick around this for a while, and you start to see too much, and you just... I wish I could say that there was something more, but the problem is, even if people did want to organize, I think the crisis moment will come when the CDBC comes, because then everything will be monitored. And, they're saying maybe May of next year. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know the exact time of it, but that's certainly where the government, paperwork, whatever all the things they're working on with the banks are lining up for around at that date. So it's not a lot of time for people to organize. And I just don't think they will, because, I mean, even if you try to organize, there was an article on Newsmax today. It was talking about how federal agents were complaining that Washington keeps sending them out there to look for white supremacists instead of dealing with actual crime. And that's the problem. They're just telling the story they want to tell, and they don't care if it's connected to reality. They love when you rage against their lie, because if you're raging against their lie, what are you doing? Well, you're not looking for the truth. You're not looking for a way to cut them out of the system as the middleman. And that's what people need to start doing. And I just don't think we have the creativity, because it's just too damn convenient to use what's already out there.
Yeah, like having a frozen pizza and watching your favorite Netflix show.
We do all sorts of things we know are crap. We know they're horrible for us. They're horrible to us. And we just do it because it's what we always do. That's not good enough, but that's what we do.
Well, circling back, I remember there were so many things that happened during the scamdemic that people forgot. And there was just so much going on in that short time span. I remember my mother complaining about, like, everyone should be a statistician by the time this is all said and done, right? This is the amount of graphs and figures and numbers. The couple things that stand out in my mind, and I wrote an article during the scamdemic about this. One was the two pilot programs. One was in New Jersey, where they were flying drones over people's homes to see if people were adhering to the social distance edicts. And the other one was in Westport, Connecticut, where they were also flying drones to see if people were adhering to the social distance edicts. And I also think I think it was Baltimore, where they started doing low altitude surveillance, like with a U-2 spy plane going over Baltimore to watch over the city to see who is committing crimes and such. Right, this is right during the peak of all this. At the police started wheeling out all this goodie bag of mass surveillance that people just were like, they were not necessarily caught off guard, but they were being distracted by so many other things that the police were doing things like this with the drones again, New Jersey and Westport, and again low flying aerial surveillance in Baltimore.
Sure. I mean, and they do all sorts of awful pilot programs. You can look at these things around the world different ways. Like, I know they have self-spreading inoculations at this point. That's been tested. That technology's 10 years old. I mean, the ability to put biomarkers in food so then there's a blockchain where you can trace it literally into your digestive system. And stuff like this was being, and not just that, but the consolidation of the food industry. The amount of farmland that's been bought by certain people, not just Bill Gates, but or we could even talk. The thing no one talks about because no one really understands it well enough is we should spend all day talking about BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street because they own what collectively. You got three supposed capital funds basically own 20 to 40% of most every Fortune 500 company. I mean, there's these levers that are there to be seen, and it just we have a hard time kind of imagining it because it's like looking at layers and stuff on top of layers. But when you start to look into it, it does simplify a little bit that even though there are plenty of people at the bottom, it does really sort of coalesce into a neat little cone at the top of certain groups of people who have been able to play the game very successfully. And I don't necessarily take anything away from them for that, but their vision of a human future, I think, is one that has far less population, far less freedom, and mainly, and I don't think it's necessarily malign. I think it's just they have an idea of carrying capacity. I mean, if you study history, I'm a history guy. You find pretty quickly that most elites throughout history have seen most of their own peasantry, which we'll call it, as sort of a necessary evil that they have to deal with. And so we look at these radical changes in philosophy, we think, oh, the World Economic Forum. Well, Kissinger helped incept that as, right. They were creating a managerial forum in the 70s to bring industrial practices from the United States over to Europe as a means of building on work of the Bilderbergers, who were trying to link the sort of European sphere and the American sphere, or the what the Russians would call the Anglo-Saxon sphere. And they were very successful in doing that, but they've always been able to kind of focus in on these certain key points of building basically a class camaraderie where, and you see this, and this is why the Marxist Vineyard example is so instructive. They don't practice what they preach at the top levels of the people who agree with these sort of philosophies, but they never intended to because they don't see themselves as the same people. And I think if I had to make a prediction, 5 to 10 years from now, you're going to see the usage of biotech to cause what will be considered speciation to some extent. And I know it sounds crazy, but they can actually get to the point of editing single alleles at the genetic level now. So you're reaching the point between that and between incipient biotech, with graphene being able to be a conductor, a superconductor actually, that can basically operate for free within your body, which has been used for various things in tests for. You're going to see these radical changes. And just like people say, oh, well, that's crazy. Well, if I had told you 20 years ago we'd all carry a phone on us and we talk across the world where it wasn't a thing back when we used to pay for minutes, you would have thought that was nuts. But it's this movement of technology that basically goes unopposed. That's really the story of what the World Economic Forum does and what groups like that do. Doesn't mean them specifically, but the sort of background politics is a distraction to the fact that we adopt these new models of organization. If you want to go into the history of it, you look up like that old technocracy movement in the 30s. Mm-hmm. There were these things, these hints, but no one even talks about them because it gets lost in the glamour of ideological warfare. But the one thing we've learned is no matter what form of ideology you supported, this is all funneled into this sort of similar structure, this sort of secular, godless, materialistic, hierarchies. And that's, that fits that sort of business model of a technocrat. And in Behold the Beast system, that's what I basically say. There's going to be 4 groups. I think throw all the politics you think out the window. Here's what it's going to be. The technocrats who are trying to make machines into man or man into machine and all that into God. The collectivists who just want absolute equality and will destroy everything until we reach that point. The conformists who will go along because they just want it all to go away. And some crazy zealots who will probably be trying to rescue people, but will end up more often than not being splatter patterns. Sucks, but that's the future in my eyes. Then again, I have a dark view.
Well, I have two thoughts. It's either we're just going to be browner, gayer, and poorer in our lifetime. That's the one direction, and that's kind of the direction I believe we're going to be going in, where they're just going to keep the money printer going, and you'll start seeing a rise with petty crime, homelessness, things of that sort. Various areas and infrastructure breaking down, medical system. We saw what happened in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. I think sanitation is also something that might start falling apart because the garbage collectors aren't getting their pension. They're not getting paid. I experienced that firsthand in Cambodia. So that's
basic infrastructure too. I mean, who has the experience? You think people who come out of these schools want to be the guy who works on potholes? I experienced this up in northern New England. We have old guys who would go out at 3 a.m. and plow the road because it was the way it was done. You get a new guy in there, he ain't doing that. And it's a different sort of mentality. It's an entitlement mentality. And look, I don't blame people for it. I practice it. But you're going to see that sort of institutional knowledge of core infrastructure erode even further than you have. And everything will look like a Pittsburgh pothole road by the end of it. And I think it's coming. I mean, we already see it. Let's be honest. Compare what we look like to Dubai or something, or China, or any of the other well-developed rising economies, and you can see we are sliding behind very quickly on infrastructure.
Right, so there's that, and we can get lost in the weeds on that in a moment. And I definitely want to talk a little bit about the millennial situation where there's this great resignation. So we'll shelve that for a moment. The other one is that you're going to start seeing regions break off from one another, balkanization. I don't know, and maybe you can tell me, was that there was like some sheriff in Illinois talking about what they're going to be wheeling out in the state for at least maybe one county or the state of Illinois about decriminalizing murder, decriminalizing rape, and was that true? Is that for real, or is that something that's
apparently a lot of this has to do with that they're eliminating? I believe the root of this is that they're eliminating cash bail. Right. And because of that, what will happen is anyone who gets released will simply get released rather than have to get X amount of money. So I don't want to say it's untrue because functionally it's kind of correct, but it's a change in legal procedure that I believe is driving that there. And I don't want to say I'm 100% sure. I might be conflating this with somewhere else, but I think if I remember right, this is what Illinois is doing. They're basically making it where for anything but the most extreme of capital offenses, that you don't have to post bail anymore because they argue it's an equity issue that poor people can't afford to get bail. So, functionally, what's that mean? It means they're going to, put a lot more people on the streets. But I mean, the sort of crime situation in let's be honest, in Chicago is beyond insane. It's a broken location. And yet that, in a lot of ways, represents the model of what the future looks like. And it's disturbing.
Right, but here's the thing. When you do that, that creates more of tribalism and then eventually some form of balkanization. So there's contradictions as far as, okay, you want to bring out this whole great reset, but at the same time, you're knowing if someone committed a capital offense or committed murder or was accused of rape, they can get let loose. Like, eventually you're going to have some type of cartel or some of mafia come up from the ashes to put a stop to all this. And I'm a big fan of Thomas Chatham's Civil War book. It was fantastic. He wrote it in the late 90s. He still posts videos onto YouTube, though I'm like maybe one of only 50 subscribers to his channel because he's like 80 years old now, whatever, and he's in Puerto Rico. He's really cool. He's giving a great blow-by-blow on what's going on in Ukraine. But in his book, he says you're going to see the Southwest be the first to break off. Like the MS-13, the drug cartels are going to just be like, that. Enough is enough. We're going to stop lopping heads off and dumping bodies underneath overpasses. And, you're going to get this type of balkanization where eventually the cops aren't going to want to go in there because they don't want to risk their lives, which is a problem to itself where we've put the cops' lives ahead of protecting civilians. But that's neither here nor there. That's a whole other Blue Lives Matter type of argument that I've mentioned numerous times. But again, when you start doing things like this and eroding some type of civil order, you're not going to be bringing about, uh, nanobots and drone surveillance and and digital currency. You see what I'm saying? Like, I just can't see how the
I don't think
two
you're right,
mesh.
because you know what'll happen. What'll happen is what happens in the third world. It'll be run through the corporations instead of run through the state. I mean, and look at the surveillance state. Look at the censorship that was allowed on social media. If there was a Democrat in there when that happened, people would have went nuts. But because Trump was in there as a sort of useful flashpoint, people didn't get nuts about it. And that's the point. It's not who brings forth the technology. It's that the technologies themselves, being in creation, will be used by someone and will be used to a way that over time will make our dependence upon them greater. And I think if you look at it that way, maybe it helps clarify a little bit more my view, which is that it wouldn't really matter if you remove X political figure or political institution if Y will replace it with the same behaviors. So absent a major cultural shift in what we want, which I don't think is very likely, we won't see that happen. Now, you talk about balkanization for a second. Let me touch on that. Since I'm New England's favorite separatist. What I have come to think is that you talk about Illinois and thinking if there will be some sort of pushback at some point that happens. But the thing is, there's too much mobility in America. The pushback in Illinois is being felt in Florida or Texas, and this is the balkanization that's happening. Now, I know why someone like Mr. Chittum might have said, and with reasonable thought, that the Southwest would be the first to go. I don't see it as much because I think the Latino population is aspirationally white, absent probably Puerto Ricans and a couple other groups, but Mexicans certainly, and that makes up the big group of it. And I think it's easy to overlook how many people are going to Texas, specifically from California, who are not left-leaning, but are leaving because of the insanity that's there. So, I mean, we're looking at Texas and Florida as two foci from which you might see balkanization. And, in other states you might want to look at, South Carolina, Florida, really the old South, the old Confederacy, or maybe in Idaho, but I don't think as much because there just isn't the critical mass up there, and they've got certain different problems, including the fact that their culture is too caught up in America or ideology. But both Texas and Florida, I think, have a shot to do something, but I think they will represent that sort of tension. And I don't personally see the cartels as wanting to necessarily stop that. I am aware of how bad the violence has gotten in Tijuana, in Baja, as well as the fact that Mexico is getting sick of all the gringos moving down there. But I think the California Pacific coastal problems could be handled better in the sort of Texas orbit. And the sort of tension of northern Mexico in a balkanization scenario has with the Azteca homeland. I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't see Monterrey into Grande Tejas in the future if things worked out a certain way, and that they might be all right with that. They could maybe do it with like a vigorous sort of, I don't know, well, I guess you could make it Baptist Christianity because you have a lot of Catholics in that population, but you could figure something out. And I think that's kind of what we might see. But I think that in the future, whatever we see politically, it will probably matter less. And I think because our behavior, our biggest service will not be to the state. States will be somewhat interchangeable, but it will rather be our interaction with information systems that really governs our core actions in the world. I know this is very different than the way we've behaved the last few thousand years. And it's a topic that deserves enough thought, that thinking that if you always have technology as an intermediary, how much is that really determining what you do? And really what we see isn't, we see the uploading of currency into this matrix, if you think of it from that perspective, which is such a radical shift that it's almost hard to contemplate that, to think that we've really shifted from the realm of physical value to the idea of how we're just connecting to one another as a financial relationship that's primarily informational versus material. And yet it's already happened.
Well, this brings up a book that I'm currently reading, and we're going to be doing a book review on it called The Perfect War, Techno War in Vietnam. And the first chapter discusses the managerial apparatus of the war machine in Vietnam. Now, you might answer this correctly. but we can agree. Can we agree that a truck is superior to a bicycle?
Well, I guess it depends on what the purpose is for, but it'll certainly go
But
farther
play
faster.
be in the minds of the cloud people. Be in the minds of Carl Schwab, right? He would say the truck is superior to a bicycle, right?
Well, no, he would say a bike is better because there's no carbon emission, right? I mean, yeah,
Right. Yeah,
but
he would. You're right. Maybe that's a bad example, but the point being, part of the book, he's using that he mentions that these war managers were all under the same notion that the truck is superior to the bicycle. Your jungle boots are superior to a pair of sandals. Anything that the West does is superior to that of the VC or the NVA. So the
sure.
idea of them losing Vietnam is unreal. It cannot happen. It doesn't happen, right? So, but
Inconceivable. Absolutely.
it's inconceivable, right? So they control the air, they control the waterways to Vietnam, but we still wound up losing Vietnam. How is this even possible? And the crux of the first chapter was that the people that are in high places are hell bent on quantifying everything, especially in the realm of the material. They don't factor in things such as religion. They don't factor things such as direct communication. They don't factor in getting along with your neighbors, a homogenous society, so on and so forth. That anything that operates outside of this paradigm is considered the other or unreal. It cannot happen. The statisticians, the mathematicians know everything. They got it all penciled down. They have it all in schematics. That this is the perfect war. We are going to win this. And long story short, we totally lost Vietnam.
Well, I mean, the thing about Vietnam, right, is that one, it wasn't really a popular war. I mean, it was a draft war, which I think we have to remember is a very different sort of thing. And it was really the idea that developed, because I've read some of the military planners on this. They wanted to shift to a total technological war
Yes.
because they knew that they could fight any war they wanted as long as the casualty rate was acceptable. And I think we saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, realistically, it never rose above a dull war, unlike the anti-war movement during Vietnam, which was very real and very large. I mean, I don't want to speak against people who spoke against going to Iraq. There were some, certainly. Interestingly, is more or as many on the right as there were on the left. But that ultimately, that there's just when we are insulated from the cost of those wars, then we can believe we can do whatever war we want. The what they call it, the splendid little battles of peace. And when you talk about the leadership group, I remember reading about a war college game where they were war gaming the U.S. versus China, and China won 4 times out of 5, I think. And they were saying they threw it out because the result was ludicrous. But the result wasn't ludicrous. It was the hubris of thinking that you couldn't organize around an alternative principle. And I mean, this comes down to the problem of systems that we're kind of talking about here. And in the West, we have the idea that politics is separate from culture, is separate from economics. The Chinese, whatever else you might say about them, have a very different conception of this, where they see this all as united in the whole service of the one Han people. And that sort of struggle where you have a whole people mobilized as a people, uniting different disciplines, versus the Western model where we have disparate disciplines, where we think, oh, well, if I have a corporate thing, I don't have to worry about politics. The sort of mad division, like disordered chaos model may have a very hard time competing against these other models, especially as these models have traders. Like, let's be honest. I'll say it for myself. I am a trader to the Western woke model who is persuadable by an external model that would be willing to tear the one up that we labor under, maybe for something else that had a different sort of foundational basis. And this is the problem the West has. The leadership group is utterly convinced they can't lose, but the people, the little folks on which they relied, the ones they recruited for those savage wars, they can't get them to sign up. And their own allies are the least useful people possible. So they have to double down like they did on technology, like they did before Vietnam. And that will be the great weakness. Because at some point, let's say the Russians, whose whole historical model is basically we can take more pain than you can, will say, try to fight us a war of attrition, thinking that America or the West won't have a stomach for it. And as we get into a very cold winter, I think we're going to see that civilizational conflict that people like Samuel Huntington and others prophesied really come into full focus.
Well, do you really expect it to get that bad in Europe? It's
I
funny
do.
because I remember seeing the ads for on German television. I saw the ads obviously on YouTube, and this was during the scamdemic. Them telling the German populace that you're going to expect a cold winter, and that was a year prior to all this happening. So it seems like there was a bit of foreboding, and this was somewhat pre-planned to expect natural gas shortage and fossil fuel shortage of those alike. I thought that was
You have to
interesting.
remember, it takes a while for the velocity to play out, too. I mean, the West is extremely wealthy. There were a lot of reserves. There were a lot of food reserves. But just look at the dates on the cans. You know, you're not getting the best of the stuff. And as far as the Europeans go, the Russians were providing a lot of their energy sources. A lot of the nuclear plants have gone down. The producers they would want to get it from, who are they going to get it from? I mean, you can only move so much from the Middle East to up there. I mean, they certainly would look for other oil. But let's say they want to shift to natural gas. They don't have LNG terminals in a lot of countries. So I think specifically the poorer countries of Eastern Europe will get through okay, and the sort of pigs countries, Portugal, was it Italy, Greece, Spain, are kind of used to it. But I think you're going to see a lot of pain and a lot of unrest come in the sort of northwestern core of Europe, talking countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, the UK, maybe Sweden as well. I think those are going to be the countries that are very used to a certain level of living, and not having met it, there will be a lot of unrest. We've already seen that with the Dutch farmers and their protests that have been ongoing. I mean, the French are out there every week protesting, but the UK is going to have a lot of problems with food production as well. So, yeah, I do think it's going to be a really rough winter over there. And I think that where Europe's problems will be primarily economic and energy related, I think the partisan warfare aspects in the United States are going to get a lot worse because let me ask you a question. Who can accept the results of the forthcoming election?
Neither side.
It's a bad position to be in. I mean, look, I'm sure it'll be stolen. I just don't know who's going to be more effective.
Well, I don't see anyone that's coming up from the ranks to run against Biden. I don't, DeSantis is obviously a shill. I'm not a fan of DeSantis whatsoever.
You see, Pompeo's going to run. That
Oh
was the
God!
news today.
Wow.
Well, he apparently the story is he wants to shunt Trump's voters from him. So, and it might work a little bit. I don't know. Maybe there's a small segment there because they want to get one of their guys through. They'd love to get someone like Liz Cheney through, but I mean, I don't know who they'd have. Probably someone like Nikki Haley or Marco Rubio, another retread. But I mean, realistically, they're going to have someone who sounds pissed off. And Mark DeSantis is a guy who probably, after Trump, has the best credentials in a lot of ways, but for reasons we understand, it's a little too convenient. It's like this thing I can't escape. Like my wife and I have this conversation. All these people are moving to Florida and Texas. Is there anywhere in Florida that's over 200 feet high? You have one little wave and you have the world's biggest honeypot. I mean, I know that's a real dismal thought, and we shouldn't go there, but after a while, I mean, if you can think with pure sociopathy, which a lot of these people do, your Kissinger types, and you're like, how do you solve the problem most conveniently? You can have some pretty dark answers that people's own behavior, our sort of grouping mechanisms, allow us to be manipulated very well, which is why what I encourage people to do, and I think we agree on this too, is to convince people to look for alternatives not provided by the system, but rather ones we envision and work out, even if they're messy and ugly for ourselves. I'm not really interested in ideologies. I'm interested in how we build networks and institutions of our own that give us resilience against these things. And I think with respect to the currency coming forward and the totalitarian measures we've seen enacted already, this will allow us to have this sort of redundant networks to work with one another, which is why I live in a rural area caught up in barter networks where, we live very modestly, but that's an intentional decision. There was a different path to be taken, but I mean, counting on the system means that you're going to have to agree with all of its dictates. And I suspect one prediction I can make without getting myself into trouble is that those dictates will only become more onerous over time for people who have the idea that privacy and sovereignty are human values worth defending.
Well, this reminds me of something that you stated maybe a couple months ago on your show, that people are fleeing to red states not based on culture but based on politics, and that sets a bad precedence overall. Can you build upon that a little bit? Because I thought that was great when you said that.
Yeah, sure. So when I was much more heavily into identity politics back in the day, I used to argue with a lot of people in the Pacific Northwest, in Idaho specifically, that you would be better served moving to Maine. And I remember having what's the guy's name? What was the guy? The guy who headed the Northwest Front. I wish I could remember his name. Not Hal Turner. Anyway, it'll come back to me. But the argument we ended up having was, I said, okay, you have a culture of individualism and libertarianism. So what is your response going to be when a bunch of people move into your area and they start turning institutions against you, which, by the way, is happening in Boise. It's happening in Coeur d'Alene, where they have 3 universities. And you don't have the same resistance structures. In New England, every town is 10 by 10. Where you basically have small towns serve as isolation quarantine areas. Take Lewiston, the most hated area in Maine, where they dumped all the Somalis, okay? The most Republican town in the state of Maine directly abuts Lewiston. Why is that? It's containment. It's containment that happens because of a system, because of a culture, because of people who live in low population density, because the land is already owned. You don't have government. You don't have big cities. There's, if the great economic team was going to come to us, it would have. And yes, we are poor. Maine is poor, like West Virginia is poor. Like these places that people now are looking at, and they're like, wait a second, you don't have to deal with certain impositions. Now, look, you're taking a step back in time to do this, to be very clear, but you're doing that at the price of, or at the benefit, I should say, of dissociating yourself from the system. Because when you go into the political system, right, and you say, I'm going to move to Florida because they have a great governor and they have great politics. I mean, great. You can do that, but what happens when you lose the next election? Or what happens when the next generation comes up and the kids now produce something different? Or in Florida specifically, you have a lot of old voters there. When that group begins dying off, and I don't want to get into the micro demographics of Florida, or Texas for that matter, we know the long-term trends, and unless people start behaving differently, and now they do, so you're seeing the Republican Party cater in a different way. But I think that ultimately, if you're looking for what will hold people together when things get funny, if you believe, as I believe, that we're going for a major traumatic time, culture is going to be what does it. It's not going to be FEMA camps helping. It's going to be the Knights of Columbus handing out things in a community they already know. And you're looking for that presence of civil society. I would argue that older populations that exists in certain eastern and midwestern cities, not as much as they used to, in certain church-driven communities in the South, in certain sort of ethnic enclaves like Acadia, where I live in Maine, you will find these remnants, and that it's a dying breed, but that it gives a certain resiliency that I think is necessary because it creates the meaning of a local identity. Like you said, we keep going back to this thing about the people being sent up to Martha's Vineyard.
Right.
We can call it trafficking, but hey, red team good, blue team bad, right? And that sort of logic that we've gone into of this zero-sum game of chicken between two sides that don't have heads is going to get us into huge trouble. And when you look at it, the same media that they say, oh, the media is attacking Trump, right? But that same media is giving him all the attention in the room because he's a useful distraction. And so that's why we look at these institutional sort of bits and pieces. But parties are going to betray you. I mean, if you want something serious, you need a governor that's a secessionist. And I honestly don't believe the system as structured would allow someone who actually held those views to survive. Now, I do think it would be very popular, but I think that you would sooner see assassinations on American soil before you saw an organic movement be allowed to move through the political ranks, which creates the institutional problem. How do you organize any sort of real resistance? And we have a weird situation where the people who think balkanization is going to happen are largely being provoked by the government, right, at every opportunity, because you see any militia you see out there consists of one retard, one PTSD vet, 9 law enforcement officers, as what happened to that case in Michigan most infamously. And what ends up happening is that the people who really do understand this are just like, we're just not going to participate. we're going to be another group that sits out. So the patriots are sitting out, the entitled are sitting out. These external actors are beginning back thinking, wait, we're not going to be doing well in this system. And you have a weird system now, or a weird situation now, where a lot of people, because of the political horror of the enemy, right, or because they understand what the system has done to them, it sort of ends up being the same sort of thing, are looking externally for support. Because since America became the World Forum, now we look at the world as allies. Like, I see myself having more in common with certain nationalists across Europe than I do with people who live in this country. And that's a sad situation in a lot of ways. But knowing their thoughts, what they've been indoctrinated with, and what I believe, how are you going to work with those people? And when you get to that point, you don't have political solutions anymore. You have a broken empire where you have competing sovereignties, and you got to go somewhere where you think you can fit in and trust the people. And my only advice I'd give to people is go somewhere where you think you would feel safe. Don't judge with the politics. Judge with your own eyeballs. Walk around on the ground and see if you belong there.
Well, if would an external uh, force want to provoke some type of balkanization? I remember a Chinese senator from California that was bringing in anti air surface to air missiles into the United States. I know that Russia does play a hand on some level of American political discord. They're very good with computers, the Russians.
Sure.
So could we perhaps see something to that effect, where maybe these countries would like? I mean, obviously, other nations want to see the United States fall.
The answer is yes, but it doesn't really matter, because the thing is, this idea that the Russians are radicalizing the base here isn't true. The Russians are just providing an information source to a base that's already radicalized. America's problems are not caused by Russian subversion or Chinese propaganda, really. It's caused by internal propaganda from its own class on the one side and the disillusionment of people on the other. So I guess what I'd argue is not that they don't do these things, but that they're not decisive. They're rather derivative, or they're helpful. So, I mean, in one sense, I mean, maybe you could see like the Russians maybe help tip the scale somewhere, or you could see maybe like you could see an election fixed by some side. In conspiracy land, there's a suggestion that Trump had better spies helping him not see 2016 stolen, but that the all-out effort saw 2020 taken. And when you look at some of the how should I say, the way the votes came in at different times, it seems pretty obvious something funny happened. So, I mean, you see these games played all the time, and yes, countries do it. We do it to them, they do it to us. But ultimately, anything that causes intra and international conflict largely benefits the existing system, because it allows more military expansion, more government control of people, and really that's what they're looking for. Whether you have a patchwork of states that control everyone. I mean, put it this way: just in the same way the U.S. and USSR had a sort of a bilateral tendency to reflect one another by becoming security states. Think of the NSA Act of 1947, creation of the CIA, empowerment of the FBI, all these things that happened. You're seeing that happen again, and a new age of totalitarianism is all that will come from this if government has a larger role in our lives, which I think that they kind of want to push forward to, but they want it to seem like it's sort of a friendly, we're going to give you stuff. But for people to accept that bargain, you have to have a really traumatic experience. And that expectation of that trauma to accomplish that end is why I am predicting the next 18 months will be absolutely brutal, beginning sometime this winter.
Right, that's what your argument is always: how do they transition us from the current model to this new model without scores of millions dying?
Well, and not even that. I mean, I agree with the first part, but I think you're all right with scores of millions dying. They just don't want the blame for it. And whether you have, I mean, that's cynical, but that's the truth.
No, you're 100% right. Now, as far as boots to the ground reports with young people, I just see a senescent demographic everywhere I go. All I see is old white people. I mean, across Appalachia. I was in Charlotte maybe like a week or two ago. It was kind of a hike to get there, but I went there briefly, maybe like a year ago just to see what it was like, and all I saw was either old white people, deracinated, milk toast Wonder Bread types, and newly minted immigrants, like off the boat wearing hijabs, didn't speak English. And mind you, this is Charlotte. Okay, it's not like I'm in Queens, New York, or anything like that. And then you look at like Raleigh, which is the tech triangle, and I have family that live on the outskirts of Raleigh, and they lived there for the past 20 years, and they don't even know where they live anymore. Like, everything's been bought up by people from India. The schools, the high school is no longer white, and that, again, that's in a span of 20 years. Like, just the demographics just plummeted in Raleigh, and I can see Charlotte somewhat going the same way. Um, as far as like people my age and just their general attitudes, apathy. I think it's mostly apathetic. I know a lot of young women that are kind of like time to give the baby fever. They're in their 30s, and they're not sure where to meet a decent mate. So I see that playing out being a bit of a problem. Obviously, that's a different topic for another day. Amongst young, air quote, native born Americans, males, more apathetic, kind of just tuning out, shutting off video games. They're not driven to make money anymore. They rather just work Walmart, work in a restaurant because everything is so unaffordable, and they're just waiting for their parents to die to inherit whatever's left of the inheritance, the home, things of that sort. Cars. I mean, the cars now are unaffordable. I was just going to a car dealership, and I don't know, like a base model is like $40,000. They offer these loans out that are more than 5 years out now. So I think, generally speaking, the native born population is kind of just waiting for the next shoe to drop, because what they've been subjugated to the last couple of years, they're just like, fuck this. I'm gonna ride this out. I'm really not gonna strive to make an extra $5 an hour, because it doesn't really make that much of a difference anymore. And I've used to discuss that before the scamdemic on my show. It's like shooting BBs at a tiger tank. It's not. It's like, okay, the harder I work, it seems that the harder I work, the more things that I want are getting further and further out from my reach. I was fortunate to move out of New York, but there are a lot of people that don't have the economic means to relocate, finding another job. In fact, I don't know if you're aware of this, but people relocating from one state to another is actually an all-time low. I mean, obviously there was a bit of a dead cat bounce with COVID, but you go from New York to where? To Georgia, to Florida. You're just jumping into another frying pan that's also unaffordable. Obviously there's some different tax breaks, and certain things will be more affordable, but you're seeing a leveling effect across the United States, where you can't necessarily relocate and expect something different. You may have political differences, you may meet some new interesting people, but you're not getting that same vibe as, let's say, if you move from like New York City to rural West Virginia. Like, there was some type of differences in relocating. So, like, okay, you move from California to Texas. Well, now Texas is unaffordable because all the people from California have relocated, on top of capital flight from these blue hives where they're strapped with cash, buying homes for cash. There's that going on. Then you also have to factor in the boomer issue, which is, okay, now the boomers are running out of from these blue hives. They're selling their homes to foreigners, or to, not so much in New York, but let's say if you are from this, if you're had a home for like $40,000 in Phoenix. Now BlackRock comes in, they're willing to pay $500,000. They cash out. Now they move to a cheaper location. They're following their children to these cheaper locations, and the younger demographics are trying to run away from these older people. And the problem is that you're dealing with a demographic that has not worked in about 20 years, right? They have pensions, they have Social Security, their medical's lined up, they're getting their Fauci ouchie top up. they're coming to these locations and demanding what it is that they had from the states they've relocated from, right? So okay, I want granite countertops and I want a Mercedes Benz. Okay, but you're now in Tennessee. We don't have those things here. Well, what do you mean you don't have it? In my state, we had all this stuff, and I demand this. They want foie gras in Memphis. They want lobster bisque in like what is it? Not Burkittsville, Blairsville, Georgia. Like no, these things we don't
go
have.
there and order a hero or a grinder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go there and ask for a hero or a grinder in Eastern Tennessee.
Right. So now you're having all these older demographic again not working. They buy up the homes in these second tier cities. Okay, pushing people that the working class further out. Now they have to drive a half hour into work. Well, then you might as well live in New York. You might as well live in L.A. There's not much of a difference anymore. Furthermore, these places aren't nice.
Here's what I'd say, though. Like this is, and I think you're right. The migration is stopping. But I think that the cause is a little different, perhaps. I think it's part of the general economic malaise that you can't afford it. And the one thing that we talked about during COVID, I think you and I even talked about this once, was the rental prices being suppressed. Well, the landlords have made up for all that and then some. I mean, the rate at which rental properties are outpacing the ability of people to meet them. I mean, we may have an epidemic of homelessness before long, and then you wonder what all those properties that BlackRock was sitting on. Yeah, some of them are for urban redevelopment, for regentrification.
But they're good, Tom. But here's the thing: I got lost in the weeds on that topic with BlackRock buying up single family homes. They're just okay. Now you have an asset, and they borrow against it even more. So going back to like the 80s, okay. And I use New York New York City real estate as a great example because that's a topic I love so much. Okay, so you had all these rental apartment buildings, 6 stories. Okay, crime, crime in the 80s, 70s, 80s in New York. We know the deal, right? The landlords were insolvent. They were like, I'm giving away this property. I'm converting this building over from a rental to a housing cooperative or a condominium. I mean, back then it was housing cooperatives, right?
Just real quick question: did that have to do with rent control issues in New York City?
That also, which stems from what is it the GIs coming back and they're like, what the hell are all these black people doing in my neighborhood, right? So they get pushed out. They get pushed out to the suburbs, right? So you have white flight out of the cities. Landlords are bleeding because no one's paying their rent. So they just dump these properties. It's all you. Do what you want with it. Sign this dotted line. Now what you're seeing is that you're not getting that same problem. What you're seeing now is because of such low interest rates that these landlords are just borrowing against those properties and buying up properties in red states. And for like the higher end REITs, they're buying up single family homes and borrowing against those properties to buy even more single family homes. So they're not liquidating these assets like we thought.
So then you're going to end up with another 2008 crisis if you're right, because and it's going to be exacerbated 100 times worse because they can't quantitative ease out of the inflation problem. I mean, we know the Fed's going up another 75 to 100 basis points. So if you have people, like especially with second properties, I was a mortgage broker, so I know that business a little bit. You probably have people on things like ARMs, adjustable loans, whatever. You have cash that's moving quickly and it's requiring a quick turnaround. And between the combination of people not being able to afford it because of the industrial shutdown, as well as people not moving as much, even those hot markets, or especially those hot markets, might have a big problem very soon because the financing window is going to close. And realistically, they don't have a choice. I mean, if they're going to defend the dollar, which they'll do to the detriment of the economic welfare of every American citizen, I genuinely believe that, they're going to have to keep raising the rate. I think I was reading that the economists were saying that if you wanted to actually stop inflation, you've got to bring the discount rate from the Fed up to about 8% at a minimum, and then see. And I think we're at like 3 something now.
Right, yeah.
So if they continue to do that, you're looking at such you're going to talk about several $100,000 more on an existing mortgage. What's going to happen is real estate prices are going to, you would think, are going to eventually tank because there won't be new buyers available. Either that, or they're going to have to figure out some way to float a lot more money into people's hands. But then you get stuck in the inflation trap. So I don't know what they're going to do, but that's kind of where I see the biggest difficulty they're apt to run into.
Well, okay, so but here's the thing: they're raising the rates, but at the same time they wheel out this inflation package, and then still giving billions out of Ukraine. It's like counterintuitive. It's like just washing money from one hand to another. So I haven't seen much of a pullback in real estate. Where that's just something that I know quite a bit about. But at the same time, food is still going up. There's no inventory with cars. There's no inventory with homes. So despite the rates going up, I don't see prices going down from here on out.
I don't think prices are going to go down either on daily consumables that are required, and of course, lodging is an expense in that, but second homes are not. And plus you gotta remember, there's a glut of supply too. Like people were buying a lot of second homes for like Airbnb and secondary investments. That stuff is really going to fall apart. I mean, I see it a lot up in my neck of the woods. People bought houses like that, and now they're starting to dump them, but there's no market to buy them. I mean, other than if people want to be in areas. And, you couple this with the question of remote working. The workers like it, but the businesses don't. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I do think the idea of more people will be working independently from home will actually win out. But I think, it's funny we ended up in this large digression because you were originally talking about women not being able to meet men. I will predict a trend for people who find health will be to find means of social engagement that exist independent of technology. I personally would recommend to a church, but meeting people in person is something that people really suck at. But in truth, it is not really hard to meet people if you have a fair system. But the sort of way in which dating apps game this thing towards what do you call it? Where you have all the females trying to sleep with the Chad. It's just utterly unsustainable. And if there's one thing that might wreck this system, interestingly, it seems like you positioned yourself, at least rhetorically, right at the center of where that energy is. Because one thing that will make people revolt is if a bunch of young men are out there and they're not finding women to be with. Now, whether or not pornography and virtual stimulation can make up for that is an interesting experiment that we're going to live. But in other parts of the world, historically, when you've ended up with situations like this, you've seen a reactionary movement towards something that is heavily patriarchal. And you would expect, if we lived under normal historical circumstances, or if we lived in a free media, we saw the inception of those movements going back 5-6 years now, and they should have and would have gotten bigger in an organic environment. But unfortunately, we were so economically castrated that they have only become sort of like where we are commentators talking about truths that are not being observed, looking to a future that doesn't make sense because it operates on a criteria we don't quite perceive rightly correct yet.
Well, civil engagement is completely dead. I mean, you're talking about the Knights of Columbus, and again, it's all boomers. I took listening to you a little bit and chatting with Patrick. I decided to go back to church, and again, it's either Hispanics or
hallelujah,
or it's again older white people. I don't necessarily see people under the age of 40 going to church. So the erosion of civil engagement, and I actually will put forth that it's deliberate, especially with the Catholic churches, as if they want to push people out of the pews, to say the least. If I think of the last ceremony I went to, Sunday Mass, they started talking about Ukraine and the Jews are wonderful, and you have to support Israel, and we have to donate to Zelensky because you like Star Wars.
Zionism is the death of the Christian church. Yeah. It's absolutely, and I will say, look, I'm a pastor. It's biblically indefensible. Go read if you want. I think it's Revelation 2:9. Talking about the synagogue of Satan, and that if you read in Christ's words, literally where he says, that even in the Bible, the veil is torn because the temple is taken down because the temple is now in the living God, the Lord Jesus Christ. and the history of it. Rick Wiles over at True News a couple years back did a really good coverage of how the Christian movement, the evangelical movement broadly, Catholicism has a different history that
Right.
I'm sure is equally valid, but what you see is the inclusion of these ideas in this weird Judeo-Christianity that's morphed onto people. And what I'll say is, this is something I personally deal with. There is a strong movement and a desire for a young, vigorous Christian movement that is very unapologetic in defending biblical positions. And if you read the Bible closely, which institutional churches of both Protestant and Catholic varieties generally don't, the Bible is a lot more based than you think about the sort of things it says and about the way society should structure themselves. And I think you're going to see much more of that sort of, what you guys would probably call church militant emerge. And people want that because Americans aren't really attuned to believing in ourselves in terms of ethnos so much. We could argue whether that's smart or not, but we like to think we are our ideas. We hold them strongly. We have a long and storied history of fighting over ideas, and a battle of a resurgent faith. I think you will see will have some value. I think you're going to see that in Mexican Catholics. And I think you're going to see that in, with some form of a more militant form of white evangelism. It won't be all white because it's the Christian construct is a little different, but you will see something like that emerge that will be much more militant. Specifically because it will have to. The church is going to end up taking on the social functions in rural areas that the cities will be unable to meet when times of austerity comes. And much like you see how like a Muslim Brotherhood emerges as a charity into a militant group in Egypt, or even if you look at some of the early history of how the IRA emerged, it's a pretty common pathway to see civic societies emerge as the foundation for oppositional movements. And I think that that's something we should expect. And we already see it. I mean, what was it? That Torva's book, Christian Nationalism, is running pretty hot. And it's a way Americans are looking for a means to be radical and sustainable in that radicalness. But that I mean more than just a single personality. And so there's sort of this searching and reaching. And I think the right, broadly speaking, has come to the point of understanding, of knowing that negotiating with the left is crazy, and that those terms are sort of moving away, where there's the woke, godless sort of atheistic scientism. And so what's going to emerge against that, rightly or wrongly, is going to be its opposite number, which will be, a traditional sort of movement, highly religious, probably somewhat dogmatic, and that is going to be very unapologetic. And I think that will be the next big political trend. I mean, it will be successful in a lot of areas. It will be very successful in the South. And as we've seen the bifurcation of media into these sort of separate groups, I mean, that's one of the things the system struggles with. How do we control this militarism that's out there? Which is why you see them saying, oh, it's going to be a civil war. It's going to be a civil war. They want to deploy the state against the movement that is going to eventually arise against them, so that they can continue to maintain control. And whether or not they're able to successfully do so will be one of the more interesting things to watch going forward.
Well, you weren't live streaming at the time of Biden's, I don't know what you want to call it, kind of Nazi-esque, preaching from the podium about.
You mean the Philly speech?
Yeah, I like to hear your take on that, because that kind of coincides with what we're discussing.
Yeah, no. First off, the funny thing about that scene is the wide shot looks a lot less bad because the blue is on the backdrop. I went to Philly, so the blue is on the backdrop and the red is on the building, but it looks so fascistic. I mean, this is a dogma where they are encouraging. I mean, Biden specifically is encouraging the hatred of a group of Americans. They're trying to basically paint the MAGA Republicans as Nazis. And believe me, they're not Nazis. They are nothing close to that. I mean, which we both already know. But the idea that they would go this far demonstrates how concerned they are about this group that's out there, and the need to paint them into a box that's useful. Now, that box could just as easily consist of political conflict or even military conflict within the United States, because we're playing on a global chessboard. But ultimately, what they don't want to have is an organic form of nationalism that could oppose what's happening right now. And what they're trying to do is kind of use Trump and his various hijinks to discredit an idea that's bigger than him, which is just the idea that Rousseau supported of popular sovereignty, that the nation should defend its own people and the rights therein. But that's kind of how I look at it. I mean, I think Biden gets away with a lot because people see him as senile. And I think it's kind of a clever trick, to be honest with you, at this point. He's obviously, or the people who are responsible for him are obviously not as deluded as they seem in terms of not being aware of things. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean they're not absolutely batshit insane.
Well, the way I'm looking at it is having Biden as a president is that they are mocking the 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 process, the due process of an election, of how we form government. That they're willing to put this guy who is probably in depends, who does have some form of cognitive issues, that we're gonna put him here, and there's nothing you can do about it because we control who is gonna sit in the White House. So it's like, yeah, we can put this guy here, and there's nothing you can do about it. We put this senile, corrupt individual who no one likes. We're gonna make it clear that he is the most popular U.S. president in our history. And there's not much you can vote to your heart is content. There's nothing you can do about it because we, at the end of the day, control the power, the arms of power.
And the thing about it is, it's sort of a clever way to do that with the left, because in a broader sense, the right has always relied on exceptional leadership. The right is always going to be more individualistic. It's going to look for a leader to emerge, and every time a leader gets emerged, what happened? I lived through this. I was a town manager once. They threw me through the ringer, even though I represented a town of under 1,000 people, 50 miles from the nearest street light. Why? To make an example. And that's what they are very good at. They prevent the rise of institutional organization, and they're very good at keeping it. You look at the way the money flows between the NGOs. You talked about Scott Howard, his excellent work on this. These sort of things, you're fighting against these institutions. And the thing is, we make it personal, but it's really not personal in this sense. We're fighting against these major institutions. And I guess the question I would ask is, where are our institutions? Where is our own currency model to oppose the international banking system? Where is our educational model? Why aren't we, seeing more kids schooled outside of it? And to credit, it's happening somewhat, right? We're seeing homeschools, charter schools, whatnot. But that's what needs to happen. And interestingly, if that happens, the bifurcation becomes complete. So we have to move along the map, or we kind of float amongst one another, or we go to war. And it's kind of tragic, though, because at every step of the way, it's the people at the top who've been pushing us into these sort of conflicts artificially, so that they can kind of play, one side against the other. It's the old Hegelian dialectic crap. But, from a spiritual sense, I look at that and I think, well, that's the same game they've been playing since the Garden of Eden. Ooh, I have secret knowledge. You just need to do this and not listen to this person. I mean, that crap worked at the beginning of time, and it's still continuing to today. So, I mean, what are you going to do? The only way you can win is if you fight human nature. That's why I'm going to be preaching in about 11 hours, So at least some of us can try to do that. And then maybe, at least if we see it coming, we won't get, fooled.
Well, I want to read an excerpt from Techno War. This is from the first chapter, page 16, Trailing the Beast. American intervention in Third World not only brings technology and consumer goods into play, but also brings reality to the Third World. In claiming the West's radical monopoly on knowledge and knowing reality, the Third World becomes unreal. Those who live there and have retained the essentially pre-Newtonian view of the real world is almost entirely internal to the observer, are therefore totally unlike the West and its leading country. Those who are totally unlike us and live in their own delusions are conceptualized as foreign others. The foreign other can be known only within the conceptual framework of technological development and production systems. For instance, the other may have bicycles. Bicycles can be readily comprehended by the West as a form of underdeveloped transportation,
as opposed to the trucks and automobiles found in the developed West. Bicycles are less than cars by definition. In this sense, the other can be known insofar as he is like us, he's so far down on the scale of power and knowledge. Insofar as he is not like us, he remains the foreign other, living his self-delusional in an unreal land. Who defeated the most powerful nation in world history? Question mark. Who defeated several hundred thousands of troops equipped with the most advanced weaponry that the most technologically sophisticated nation had to offer? Question. Who defeated a war budget more than $1 trillion? Question. For the most part, peasants of undeveloped agricultural economies defeated the United States. The insurgents of what was called South Vietnam were peasants. What we called North Vietnam was also a relatively primitive agricultural economy with little industrial base. How could a nation of peasants with bicycles defeat the United States? By Kissinger's theory, such a defeat is unthinkable. Kissinger's claim to a monopoly of true knowledge for the West turns into its opposite, classifying nations and peoples purely on the basis of their possessions or lack of technological advances. Production and warfare systems leads to only to radical reduction of what can be considered as valid knowledge about the world. This regime of power and knowledge thus creates a world that is almost entirely internal to the observer. Kissinger writes that the West is deeply committed to the notion that the real world is external to the observer, that knowledge consists of recording and classifying data, and more accurately, the better, he calls this Newtonian view of the world, after 18th century theoretical physics Sir Isaac Newton. I thought that was really cool. And it kind of coincides with this idea that we keep, as technology advances, that you're going to have some type of guerrilla tactic and ad hoc this way around this Borg of technology, because there are ways of defeating it. Obviously we bring in Star Wars, even though it's fictional and not, it's obviously fictional.
Well, you need, all right, yeah. So let's think through it, right? I mean, I've written about this a little bit. You need things like pocket EMPs so that drones can't bother you, and the problem is, let's pretend you have little nanobots trying to get in your bloodstream. You would probably need to, unfortunately, reverse engineer the technology, and unless you have some way of interfering with, its ability to exist or have carrier signals, you'd have to think that way. And so it ends up being micro warfare, right? And the problem with warfare is usually the advantage goes to the attacker because they have the element of surprise, and that, defense is inherently a sort of a limiting concept. So that is the problem we deal with as individuals, that we have the world basically against us, in the sense that it is saying, look, we want you to conform, we want you to collectivize, we want you to come together in that sort of thing. But to use your example, since you talk about Vietnam, the simplest reason why the Vietnamese won is because they had nowhere else to go. When you're fighting old Sun Tzu, you're fighting on desperate ground, killing ground, you're going to win. And, that's one of the interesting things here that maybe gives us a little hope. The people who are fighting us have us completely beaten in one sense, but they might have us beaten so badly that they might be stupid enough to pick a fight. And if it actually got into a hot shooting fight, there might be some hope. I mean, I know that's a weird way to put it because people don't want to think that way. But honestly, once a certain line is crossed, people will begin rediscovering themselves. And in that, there might be some hope that there would be a different way to look at things. But I mean, we've seen civilization rearrange itself quite a few times. If we can keep our humanity from being too contaminated by technology, I would say that gives us a better shot. But I would also say this, unless spiritual things that I talk about, that the Bible talks about, are true, there isn't theoretically a way you could prevent an invasive nanotech unit being used on you to stop it from doing whatever it's going to do inside you. I mean, put it this way, we cannot will a microbe within us to not act. So we're going to need some help. So I think what we're going to see is that age of secularism and materialism has run its course.
Yeah.
And now we're going to see a new conflict. We're going to see an age of faith. But the question is, will it be faith in technology or faith in whatever spiritual belief? I hope it's Christianity. But with that, and I think that's going to be the new model that we saw previewed in a lot of ways by the wars we had in the Middle East, by the sort of civilizational cultural model you were talking about earlier, where they are built on a different foundation than, sort of Newtonian materialistic model the West resides within. And we ultimately reside in the model of sort of like peak comfort, and that there is a material description. But I think the thing that the West is changing, and I think this is the difference, is we are moving away from the material reality as something that we experience to a mental projection of such that we allow everyone to commit to, and the bargain that people are going to have to decide if they want to take or not take, first in the West, but then beyond that is, are we going to just all sign up to play the game because it's more fun in a world that is increasingly going to be ugly? And I do think these next few years, let's go beyond the United States. Look at the global South, its inability to feed itself because of bad leadership, because of policies that are just terrible, at the global level and at the local level. So as these conflicts play out, I think that escapism is the thing that's going to be hardest for us to sort of resist. And I think that's the offer that's going to be out there. And, I don't know. I think that if they're smart enough to leave people out, they're going to take it, because, frankly, most people are just not very capable these days. And I'm not saying that to be insulting. It's just the nature of what you have to do to survive in this economy is such that it does not encourage people to be self-reliant generalists who can survive adverse times outside the system, especially as we fall into the pattern you described earlier, much like other countries that America hasn't known, but where children wait for their inheritances. You have a pater familias type model, where you have wealth is linear, it's generational, families are more attached. And that is something we're not used to. It's very common globally, but America is no longer the frontier of opportunity. And you're going to see that retrenchment, I think, be a highly conservative, action. It might see more small scale local violence, but that it will serve as a check against the sort of organization that would be required for something larger, unless you see A, the government behave that stupidly, or B, some new zealot-based movement, emerge that can resist this. And I do rate those as possibilities. I mean, I actually think it'd be a good idea if it happened, but I don't know if people are ready for that yet. We're still a couple of years away from people reaching that level of desperation.
Well, this brings up something that I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned something about food scarcity. What was your thoughts on my article that went viral as far as energy?
Which one? Because you had me read a few of yours.
Basically, the premise of the article is that we're running out of cheap energy, which is why we had the scamdemic and the knock-on effects where they want to bring about solar panels, wind energy, and obviously with the war in Ukraine, which I do want to wrap the night up on the situation over there, that you see more of this war on energy transpire, and our inability to feed ourselves, especially the third world, which is more or less that was kind of like what I wanted the readers to take away from it, is that we're subsidizing a lot of these third world nations. Obviously, if you look at Africa, they didn't do that on their own. Between the Bill Gates Foundation and various NGOs. You look at Egypt, which is I forgot what I wrote down, but more than half their population receives some type of food subsidies. You look at places like Bangladesh, China.
Their primary food source is Ukraine, right?
Yes, that's right. So I want to pick your brain on that. Do you think what we're seeing is more of a battle of energy, and COVID was a bit of a knock-on effect to push forward a lot of these type of green energy policies?
It's a fair question. I mean, I guess what I think is that I do believe energy scarcity is being pushed. I do think it's somewhat artificial in the sense that, let's say you're right about shortage of, fossil fuels, okay? Which I don't necessarily agree with, because I am actually sort of a believer in abiotic oil, based on some things I've read out of Russia. But leave that aside for a moment. Take nuclear power, which is far less contentious.
Yeah.
It would have been very easy for these countries, and some countries like Poland actually are going all in on this to give themselves the sort of energy resiliency. But that choice wasn't made, and that these states are making choices, especially in Europe, Germans especially, that are so counter effective to their long term survival. It's kind of insane to me. And it makes me think that the people who are in charge of those countries have to be serving some other interest.
Mm-hmm.
It's just too damaging to their own economies. Like you were saying, was it 43% in Britain? And I know the numbers are huge like that in Germany too, because Germany has high labor costs, they have high industrial costs, but they basically subsidized it through cheap Russian energy. And now they can't do that anymore. And the prices become utterly stupendous for them to deal with this. So, I mean, I'm not thinking that's so much the issue, but I do think energy austerity is something that is being pushed because the green economy, I mean, they talk about climate change, right? So what are they changing? The climate of what people expect. So they're acculturating people to should I say, an economy of scarcity, of low consumption, so that people are getting used to the idea of living in relative poverty. And you could, if you're at the top, okay, and your model as a structural model is you want to stay at the top, if you can knock the middle down to be poor by lifting the poor up a little bit so that they grab them down by the ankles, which is kind of how I look at political warfare. You know, it's like when you see people who go and they get mad about somebody gets a welfare check for $500, but they don't care if a corporation robs a country for $5 billion. You know the type of person I'm talking about?
Of course.
Usually Southern redneck Republicans. I
Yeah.
hate to say it, but it's true. That sort of thinking is why this system proves so resilient, because power does not manifest in an easily understood way, because it manifests through, it really manifests through the way the system moves structure and leverage, where people treat it, oh, it's an inevitability. Money just works that way. Technology just works that way. And it's in this absence that the real power is. The things we think are inevitable are the things that we absolutely need to question. And until and unless we start doing that, we're going to struggle very hard to change anything. So with energy scarcity, since that's what you asked about, I don't know if we're dealing with that at that level or not. I look at different sources, but I know that the scarcity is being ratcheted up artificially at this point through bad policy, whether intentional or not. It's going to have the effect of people demanding that government meet their basic needs. That means subsidized energy costs, like G7 was saying with oil prices, and it means having universal basic income, which once people are utterly dependent on government for their money, there's a long history of research of what people do to stay on welfare. And a lot of people are in that spot. And hey, I don't blame them. You have to, if you know how the benefits work in the United States of America, all right, you probably have to make an extra $20,000 to $30,000 a year than whatever the low end wage is in order for that to make sense. And that's in an economy where rent is relatively cheap. I can't imagine how much worse it is in a city where it's 1,000, 2,000, whatever. You know, I live out here in the sticks where things are still a backwater. But at the heart of it, people can't afford that. And that's why I think people will say, hey, you know what? Rather than having this terrible deal where, yeah, you have freedom, you can't afford anything, we'll give you a little bit of energy. Everyone will be in just as bad a place, right? We'll give you a little house. And if it sucks, that's fine. You're in the same boat. We're going to bring everyone down and we're going to be at this spot. And that's what it all comes down to. And I suspect on the flip side of that, you might see cold fusion just emerge, because it's just a hunch. But I know it's been a long time corporations that deal in scarcity, like Big Pharma does with certain medical treatments.
Right.
They've been very happy to take things and put them on the shelf until the time they're useful. I mean, China's made an artificial sun, for God's sakes. I'm not even making these things up. This is just public news. People just don't connect the dots because we're not trained to. We're too caught up in our regular distractions.
Oh, 100%. I'm with you. You know, that article, I was kind of just punting it from a different point of view. I do know of
your writing is excellent, by the way. I've always enjoyed reading it when I have the opportunity.
Yeah, that one was self-edited, and it's not my best work, to say the least. I just was taken aback by how many views it got, and I got I was like 3 or 4 people reached out to me to do an interview on it. I'm like, this is not my forte. I am not a scientist or geologist or environmentalist. I just laid out some factoids from books I was reading. But, look, my concern is obviously the third world. If energy becomes less abundant, you're going to see a huge backlash in a lot of the undeveloped countries. We saw it in Sri Lanka. I think that, that was like the first country to fold. Again, I look at Egypt, I look at Yemen, I look at a lot of these countries that we're heavily dependent on oil from. If we stop purchasing oil from them because of, whether it's because of green energy or whether the fact that they're running out of, black gold pumping out of the ground, that was more or less what I was kind of going with. And then obviously Ukraine. So the last time you came on the show was when the war in Ukraine just unfolded. There seems to be a stagnation on the Russian side. From what I understand, the Russian military has only deployed 6% of its military to that region. We have not seen so much, movement from their Air Force nor their Navy. I have not seen any cruise missiles. I have not seen any T-90 tanks. I see a lot of hand-me-down equipment on the Russian side where they're shooting old AK-47s. Their military that's been deployed there, guys that are pretty old and very young. There hasn't been too much of a change as far as who I visually see in videos. Again, I'm seeing a lot of young guys that are like 18, 19-year-old men fighting, and I see guys that are well past their prime also fighting alongside them. And then obviously the Chechens are there to do some type of the cleanup work. And then on the Ukrainian side, I see a lot more foreign mercenaries. I see a lot more equipment supplied by the West, a lot more drone technology. Germany's now sending in some of their tanks and armored personnel carriers. Not good. And now Russia, this past week, they've decided to start bombing critical infrastructure inside Ukraine, which is what they've been trying to avoid. This endeavor. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So what I've been seeing in the latest reports is that, all right, so Russian military doctrine is basically this, that shells are cheap and units are expensive. So what they basically do is they try to artillery bombard the death out of people so that way they just go scorched earth and they go marching across because that's a Russian strategy.
Right.
So a major change that happened was when the HIMARS system, which is the U.S. artillery system, was starting to get on the field. And I suspect they are NATO troops more broadly from friendly countries as well as U.S. trainers that are there instructing the Ukrainians as to use. I have heard the same as you do, that NATO is heavily embedded there. Not only that, the Russians are aware of it. And that is causing a major difference, that it has cut the disparity from 10 to 1 to 3 to 1, which for defensive purposes has been enough for Ukraine to be able to basically blunt the Russian offensive due to basically corruption and bad logistics. It does seem like the Ukrainians made real gains on the Kharkiv front. It seems like the Russians are consolidating their ownership of Donetsk, Luhansk, and probably beyond their retreat from Kherson. We're seeing that, but then you see these fighting over the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. What was it this week? Putin's motorcade. Apparently one of the limos got blown up or something. Mm-hmm. Not to mention the whole thing with the Duke and daughter. That's weird. It almost feels like it might be a third party because there was a hit out on potentially on Zelensky as well. But I think that the West feels like they've got this in a position where it is a sort of war of attrition. And if Russia, who's only committed about a fifth of their forces into this and hasn't gone for a general mobilization, doesn't go bigger, then this could sort of get stuck for a while. And then you have to think, well, who does a war of attrition benefit? And this is where it comes back to the energy question about Europe and what Russia's strategy is going to be. Do they choose to advance this fight in Ukraine, or do they work with their Chinese allies? Maybe an invasion of Taiwan comes down the line, and you see this sort of logistical fight play out. Right now, I mean, the question, I think right now, and I think this will probably resolve, because I know there's a lot of internal pressure in Russia because they want to see progress, and Putin's position may, if you believe some of the analysis, may be caught up in the success of this, not so much for what's external to the country, but some of the internal hardliners. The elites like being linked to the West. They like having their money and their yachts and hanging out, in Monaco. So that is something they miss. And the people at the bottom want jingoistic nationalism. They want a bigger fight, and they understand they're fighting the West. So it'll be interesting to see if they push it forward. But I give the Ukrainians credit in the fact that they've been able to hold out that long, even though they've been heavily bolstered by the West. And the amount of money that is going into Ukraine is absolutely insane. A lot of it is money laundering into defense industries. But also, one of the stories that's not being talked about is that the broader European population and Poland and other countries, I think, are getting sick of all these Ukrainian immigrants at some point. Now, Poland would love to take a chunk of that country in certain ideas to put that forward. But in terms of what I think is going to happen in the near future there, Russia has to choose if they want a broader war against the West. And if they're going to make that choice, it would seem that the smarter play for them would be to go into the winter, not expanding the war, pick a line that's defensible in Ukraine of what they want, if Putin can get away with this, and try to freeze Europe out and see what happens there. And that's kind of what I think will happen. But on the other hand, it is possible anytime some misunderstanding, a political blow up, a sensitive target. Putin and the Russians have said that if the U.S. gives the Ukrainians any longer term or longer distance artillery, they will treat it as a red line. And, Russia is probably going to take their red lines pretty seriously because, we can look at this from a reserve, but there are Russian men and women dying over there. And there will be a price that, at some point that blood will have to be mollified in the Russian population. And someone in the West is going to have to take a hit after all the blame we've been given for that. And if it doesn't happen sooner in a symbolic way, I would actually be more frightened because to me that would suggest greater coordination in terms of either a longer term destabilizing tactic or the potential for a wider theater level warfare. But we see a lot of pieces. Armenia is kind of falling apart, and there's a weird conflict there. Kazakhstan is still playing footsie with the West, which is really weird. Because remember, the week before Ukraine broke off, that happened.
Right.
So we'll have to keep a real close eye on that. And then Turkey joining the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. I don't know. I can't figure out what game the Turks are playing at. I mean, I know they want to resurrect the Ottoman Empire, but they may end up getting them so squashed by everyone if they keep playing all sides against the middle. It's a dangerous game they're playing in Istanbul.
Well, Turkey's always stuck between a rock and a hard place, and they've been trying to figure out a way to weasel themselves out of that situation because they're stuck between the West, they're stuck between Russia, they're stuck between China, and they also want to expand. And this goes back to the war in Syria that we gave them a lot of lip service, like, yeah, we're gonna let you join the EU, just let a bunch of Muslim jihadists into your country to go fight over into Syria, and then we kind of just snubbed Turkey, and they didn't get anything out of it, and then Turkey went around and says, oh yeah, well, we're just going to flood your country full of refugees. So that was a big middle finger back to the EU for not playing, not holding up their end of the bargain. I see in Ukraine the absolute diaspora of Ukrainians, because Ukraine was already seeing a diaspora. Demographically, they weren't doing too good, if I recall correctly, and now this only exasperated people out of Ukraine, and I just feel like this is kind of like a weird form of genocide for the Ukrainians, where they're just going to be immersed into the greater EU, and like the Ukrainian language will be something of a footnote in history. And obviously,
you already see that happening in the EU. One of the big movements that's happening over there is the effort within the EU to take away the national veto, saying that it makes it unwieldy. And if the national veto escapes from there, then functionally you will have a federal Europe. And I mean, at this point, especially with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, it's hard to imagine Norway will perpetually remain outside the EU. You would fundamentally have the consolidation of a sort of bloc. And maybe that's what we're going to see. We might see more like localized authority on some level, but you can kind of see the outlines of a couple blocks forming, right?
Right.
Europe as a sort of contiguous bloc. I would argue the U.S., Canada, and I know people will hate this, but probably Mexico at some point may be in a similar sort of boat where you see that, especially if you see, a more militant world out there. I mean, whether or not you want to include the Mexicans or not is an interesting question. But you could see that, or you could see maybe China go into Mongolia and more directly control their satellite in North Korea. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time. I think the old order has broken. I'm not sure we know what the new order is yet. I think that's what the contest is kind of about.
Right.
Is it a rehash of another era of history where we see that we're fighting over the same stuff, or does the war change? And I think that's the thing. Technology has sped up time. So what we think we knew, like if you and I were having this conversation 3 years ago, the sort of stuff we're talking about now would seem completely nonsensical, and yet we've adopted and adapted to this. And I guess that's the one last challenge, which is things are moving so fast, we mentally just can't keep up with
Right.
it. And that's the other reason why things don't happen, because we could talk about things and we can imagine them, but I'm like, it's really hard when it's moving as quick. And I've given up trying, with prognostications. I mean, I can talk about trend lines, but trying to predict schedules, it just never ends up being right, because the truth is things do change a little bit slowly because people don't see the benefit in it, and they kind of try to keep to their old ways, but they're not stopping the new from coming into being. We keep having the new coexisting at the same time as the old, and it's a weird time frame. But I think that ultimately what we're seeing is old models basically just going out in obsolescence, because people aren't going along with them anymore. So it's definitely an interesting time, and it's one that we'll have to keep a very close eye on moving forward. But I don't know what we should really expect to see, other than that I think things could change radically and completely in a very short period of time. I'm not saying they're going to, but what I will say is this: is just imagine, if we go a week without power in this country, how resilient we would be in dealing with that. And if you're like me and think the answer is not that much, then you might say maybe we should try to be more mentally prepared than we've been in the past.
You miss too much these days if you stop to think, no question about it. I remember with Sandy, we went 2 weeks without power on Long Island, and the first week it was fine. By the second week, people started getting a little antsy, little pushy, like, all right, power needs to come back on now. Anyway, I won't keep you up for any too much longer. I gotta go and eat something. Listen, I mean, obviously I've been following you for a while now, man, and I'm a bit upset that you are no longer on YouTube. What? I know you're working on more writings. Do you have any plans on reinstating a YouTube channel? Do you maybe switch to BitChute?
We do
or
have
Odyssey?
a ministry. We have a ministry channel. We do for Sons of Dust Ministries. For those who are in the Telegram group, you can find the link in there. t.me/Atlantic Homeland. I'm still trying to build that up. Realistically, trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. I'm working on a couple different projects. I'm working on one to think through how an alternative to a central bank digital currency could be realized by grassroots actors. Continue to do the soul saving work. That's always important stuff. And really, I don't know. I didn't. It would be an interesting conversation for you and I to have, because we have certain theological differences. But it would be. I do actually put a lot more thought into how to construct a theological model at a grassroots level to help people begin organizing themselves in a way that begins connecting people organically, that brings together these disparate areas of knowledge. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to be doing for a little while will probably be quieter, which isn't a bad thing, because Lord knows I spend all the time writing, articles about things I say. And we've reached the time where, the warnings have been laid out. All my books, Lord knows, Behold the Beast System, Surviving the Fall of America, Come Out of Babylon. I've basically beat the subject to death. What we have to begin doing is realizing how we're going to prepare for these things. It's better to be proactive than reactive. So I'll be working on that. As far as doing the other stuff, talking about it, it's always fun to come on. And I do commentary within the Telegram group. I just, I wish I could talk about the stuff that's actually interesting and that's important. But man, every time I try, whatever platform I go to, I just can't do it. And what I've realized is it doesn't matter. You're not going to educate people. What you got to do at this point is you got to find people like yourself. So that's what I do in building a congregation. So I would certainly invite people, if they want to check out the channel. Actually, I could probably do this. I could put a link if you want, because it's always good to grab a couple subscribers. And I saw that you shared that over at Pinelanders. But what I would like to say before we get to the very end of this is I just want to say thank you for having me on. Definitely appreciate that, and appreciate the content stuff you put up there. It's very good. It's unfortunate you're down south. We'd love to have you as a proper New Englander, but always something to work from. So that's that. You'll see the little link. That's me. Put Tom here. Hi, everyone. There we go. And other than that, that's all I kind of have for tonight. I want to say thank you for chatting with me for a few hours, and let's do it again sometime in a few months. I know I still owe you a show on the Taiping Rebellion, which will be a lot of fun.
Well, I haven't cracked. I'm waiting for you to crack open the book. Then I'll crack it open. I think game plan going forward. I'll definitely have you on before the year is out. Maybe we do an end of the year wrap up, and we'll definitely do a book review on the Taiping Rebellion. 100%.
Yeah, it'll be fun to talk about that. We'll definitely keep in touch. And for everyone else who's been listening, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for all you guys who've been supportive reading the book. I can see some people in your chat who I actually know. So good luck to you guys. Hey, keep speaking the truth, and just make sure you spend just as much time offline as on, because this system here is not our friend.
100%, man. Listen, you enjoy the rest of your night. I'll shoot you a message during the week, all right?
Sounds awesome. Have a good night.
You too. Take care. All right, that was Tom, everyone. Just a quick note on the show. Taking next week off. When we return, we're going to do Adam Smith's book. We're going to be talking, getting lost in the weeds on his writing. I believe Patrick, and Expat will be on for that show too. I have another writing that's going to come out probably in the next couple of weeks. Keep you all up to speed on that. And that's pretty much it. Thanks again. Thanks, guys. No I am tonight. But he will be back in, not next week, the following week. Bye.